It was a world unrecognizable to us now, a place where every breath meant survival and every sound carried the possibility of danger. A million years ago, life was not measured in days or months, but in heartbeats and the fragile moments between predator and prey. The land was wild and merciless, an endless expanse of forests, rocky plains, and jagged rivers that cut through the earth like scars of time itself. Here, prehistoric man took his first uncertain steps, not as the ruler of the world, but as its most vulnerable inhabitant. Unlike the predators that roamed the land, saber-toothed cats with their dagger-like teeth, packs of giant hyenas whose laughter meant death, and towering beasts that could crush a man beneath their feet, these early humans were fragile, naked, and unarmed. Their only tools were sharp rocks chipped into blades. Their only strength, the instinct to endure, and their only weapon was unity. The nights were the hardest. When the sun slipped behind the horizon, darkness stretched across the wilderness, like a suffocating blanket swallowing everything in silence broken only by distant howls. Fire, when discovered and nurtured, became more than warmth. It was survival. It kept the predators at bay, but it also painted these first men as intruders in a world not meant for them. They gathered around the flickering flames, their bodies trembling not just from the cold, but from the knowledge that they were prey in a kingdom of predators. Every ember was a prayer, every spark a fragile barrier between life and death. Food was scarce, and hunting was a gamble. Unlike the apex predators around them, prehistoric humans were scavengers at first, circling the remains of kills left behind by lions and saber-tooths. They learned to approach cautiously, to strike quickly, and to disappear before the true owners of the carcass returned. Their hands shook as they tore meat from bone with sharpened stones, but hunger made them bold. Some days, they went without food entirely, surviving only on roots and bitter plants dug from the hard earth. Starvation was a familiar companion, and the line between endurance and extinction was razor thin. Water was another battle. Rivers were both a lifeline and a death trap. The same waters that quenched their thirst were also home to massive crocodiles waiting beneath the surface, silent and patient. Early man learned to approach carefully, to watch for ripples that betrayed danger, and to flee at the first sign of movement. Every sip was stolen, every moment of relief shadowed by the threat of sudden violence. Yet they endured, because endurance was the only path forward. Shelter, too, was a constant struggle. Without permanent homes, they moved endlessly across the land, following the rhythm of the seasons, tracking the herds that fed them, and escaping the predators that hunted them. Shallow caves offered some protection, though they were often already claimed by beasts stronger than man. Hollow trees and crude huts of branches became their fragile sanctuaries, but even then, safety was an illusion. Storms ripped apart there. Shelters, floods washed them away, and fire, both created and accidental, reduced everything to ash. For early humans, home was not a place. It was wherever survival allowed them to rest their heads without being consumed. But survival was not just about food, water, or shelter. It was about the constant pressure of fear. Every day was a test, every choice a gamble. The sounds of snapping, twigs, rustling leaves, or distant roars sent waves of panic through their bodies. They moved in groups not just for protection, but because loneliness was death. Together they watched the world, learned its dangers, and shared its burdens. Alone, a man was nothing. Together they were fragile, but they were something more than prey. They were survivors. And slowly, painfully, through mistakes and loss, they began to adapt. Sharp stones became more than tools for cutting. They became weapons. Branches were hardened by fire and used as spears. Their minds, restless and observant, began to see patterns, animal tracks in the dirt, the shifting, whines before a storm, the distant cries of vultures circling a fresh kill. Knowledge became their true survival weapon. And with each generation, they carried forward not just life, but lessons carved in blood and fire. Still, the world remained merciless. Disease struck without warning, wounds festered into death, and childbirth carried risks that often left both mother and child buried beneath the soil. Nature showed no mercy, and the balance of survival tilted constantly against them. Yet the fact that they endured, that they walked forward despite everything, was proof of something extraordinary. An unyielding will to live, to see the next sunrise, no matter the cost. It is easy now, in the comfort of modern life, to forget that our ancestors stood on the very edge of extinction. They had no certainty of tomorrow, no guarantee that their children would see adulthood, no promise that their struggles would amount to more than fleeting survival. And yet, in their footsteps, we see the foundation of everything we are. Each choice they made, each risk they took, each moment they endured, pushed humanity forward, step by fragile step, along the edge of survival. Theirs was not a life of peace, but of constant trial. But in those trials, they began the journey that would one day lead to us. From trembling figures huddled around a fire, terrified of the night, to the first sparks of ingenuity that would one day shape civilizations, their story began here. In the wilderness, against impossible odds, clinging to survival with nothing but willpower and the faint hope of tomorrow. And as the first chapter of their existence unfolded, one truth became clear. Life 1,000,000 years ago was not just survival. It was the beginning of humanity's eternal struggle against the world, a struggle that would define us for all of time. Survival in the ancient world was never a matter of comfort. It was a matter of escape. While early man struggled for food, water, and shelter, the wilderness constantly reminded them of their weakness. They did not walk the earth alone. They shared it with giants, with beasts whose very existence seemed designed to ensure man's extinction. And in this balance, prehistoric humans found themselves at the bottom of the chain. Every step into the open plain was a risk. Tall grasses concealed the crouched figure of a predator waiting to spring. The ground itself bore the evidence of danger. Massive paw prints pressed deep into the soil, claw marks on trees where saber-toothed cats had sharpened their weapons, the scattered bones of prey torn apart in violent hunts. These signs were not warnings to predators. They were warnings to man. And yet, hunger and thirst drove humans into these hunting grounds, forcing them to gamble with death every single day. The saber-tooth was perhaps the most feared of all. Its long, curved fangs glistened in the light, weapons capable of piercing the toughest hides with a single strike. Silent, swift, and powerful, it could stalk for hours before unleashing a sudden burst of violence that no man could outrun. Even when unseen, its presence haunted the minds of early humans. The mere sound of rustling in the brush was enough to freeze them in place, every muscle locked between the instinct to flee and the knowledge that running might trigger pursuit. Against such predators, man had no claws, no speed, no natural armor. The only hope was awareness, caution, and the strength of the group. But the saber-tooth was not alone in its reign. Packs of giant hyenas roamed the plains, scavengers and hunters both, their mocking cries echoing through the night. Unlike the solitary cat, these creatures worked together, circling their prey, testing for weakness, overwhelming with numbers. A lone man or even a small group stood little chance once surrounded. Fire drove them back for a time, but fire was fragile. Flames died in the rain, embers burned low, and once the light faded, the night belonged to the hunters again. Even larger threats existed. Lions bigger than those of today prowled in prides, striking down prey far stronger than man. Wolves moved in disciplined packs, relentless and cunning. And then there were the ambush predators, crocodiles lurking at riverbanks, snakes lying, silent in the grass. Birds of prey circling high above, waiting for weakness to reveal itself. To live in this world was to live under constant surveillance. Every movement watched by unseen eyes, every step weighed with risk. Early humans learned quickly that survival was not about strength, but about vigilance. They became watchers, constantly scanning the horizon, listening for sounds others ignored. The faint snap of a twig, the sudden silence of birds, the shifting of shadows at dusk. Theirs was a life built on suspicion, and yet suspicion saved lives. Those who ignored it rarely survived long enough to pass down their lessons. Fear was constant, but it was also a teacher. Slowly, man began to adapt not just by reacting, but by anticipating. They learned to track the movements of predators, to recognize the patterns of behavior in the beasts around them. They discovered that lions hunted at dawn and dusk, that hyenas followed the scent of blood, that vultures circling above often revealed the location of fresh kills. They became scavengers of scavengers, slipping in to take scraps of meat before the rightful owners returned, always balancing risk against reward. But even with these lessons, the cost of survival was high. Entire families were sometimes lost in the jaws of predators, and each generation carried the scars of those encounters. Children vanished in the tall grass. Elders fell behind during desperate flights, and the sick or wounded were often abandoned, for to stop was to die. Harsh as it was, this reality forged resilience. Every survivor was the product of unbroken vigilance and unwilling endurance. Yet within this constant danger lay the first sparks of strategy. Man could not outrun predators, but they could outthink them. They began to experiment with cooperation beyond mere survival. Groups worked together to shout, wave, and hurl stones at approaching beasts, driving them back through sheer numbers and noise. They discovered that fire, carried as a torch, extended fear into the darkness. Sharp stones were lashed to wooden shafts, creating crude spears that could wound from a distance. These were not yet true weapons of war, but they were the beginnings of something greater, the realization that humans could fight back. It was not always successful. Spears often shattered against the thick hides of beasts. Fires sometimes failed to intimidate the hungry or desperate. But every attempt carved knowledge into memory, and every failure taught lessons that echoed across generations. In this way, humanity began to tilt the balance, not with claws or teeth, but with thought, unity, and persistence. Still, the world offered no mercy. The predator's shadow loomed large, and each night was a reminder that firelight was a fragile boundary between safety and death. Prehistoric man lived in constant tension, caught between boldness and caution, between hunger and fear. And yet, it was within this crucible of danger that humanity's greatest strength began to emerge. The ability to endure not just as individuals, but as a collective, bound together by shared struggle and shared survival. The predators of the ancient world shaped early man not only through fear, but through necessity. To live, humans had to become more than victims. They had to become thinkers, planners, and creators. They had to transform weakness into strategy, fragility into resilience. And though their place in the world was still small, still vulnerable, they had begun to carve a path forward. It was a path lined with danger, shadowed by the constant threat of death, but it was also a path that marked the first true separation of man from beast. For while predators relied on strength and instinct, man had something else: awareness, adaptability, and the first flickering sparks of ingenuity. These would one day change everything. For now, though, they lived beneath the shadow of predators, clinging to survival in a world that sought to erase them. But within that struggle, the foundation of something greater was being laid. Step by fragile step, man was learning how not only to survive the wilderness, but to begin bending it, ever so slightly, to his will. For countless generations, the nights of early man were filled with dread. When the sun dipped below the horizon, the world became a theater of predators. a stage where every sound carried menace and every shadow hinted at death. Darkness stripped man of his limited advantages, reducing him to a trembling figure huddled among stones or trees. It was a time of waiting, of praying to survive until the morning light returned. But from within, that fear came one of the greatest discoveries in human history: fire. At first, fire was not theirs to command. It was an untamed force, born of lightning strikes that set forests ablaze, or of volcanic eruptions that painted the skies with flame. Humans did not create it. They fled from it. Yet even as they ran, they watched. They saw predators retreat. From the inferno saw beasts scatter in terror as trees cracked and sparks rained down. Fire was destruction, but it was also power. And the mind of man, so fragile, so curious, could not forget what it had witnessed. Slowly, cautiously, they learned not to run, but to linger at the edges. They discovered the warmth that lingered in glowing embers, the light that drove away, shadows. The boldest among them dared to pick up smoldering branches, carrying them from one place to another, learning that flame could be preserved if fed with wood, if sheltered from the wind, if watched with patience. This was not yet mastery, but it was the beginning of control. With fire, nights transformed. No longer did man sit blind in the dark, waiting for predators to strike. The flicker of flame created a circle of safety, a fragile boundary that even the most fearless of beasts hesitated to cross. Around fires, humans huddled close, finding comfort not only in warmth but in the knowledge that they had discovered a weapon unlike any claw or fang. For the first time, they were not entirely helpless, but fire offered more than protection. It offered life. Raw flesh that once carried sickness and rot could be laid upon flame and transformed. Meat became softer, safer, richer in taste and nourishment. Plants once too tough to chew could be roasted. Roots softened into food that sustained longer journeys. Cooking was more than convenience. It was survival. It meant fewer deaths from disease, more energy for travel, more strength for the endless struggle against hunger. In time, fire became more than tool or weapon. It became symbol. The flames that crackled in the night drew groups together, gathering families and strangers alike into one circle. Stories were born here, gestures, sounds. Early forms of language whispered beneath the glow. Fire was not just survival, it was culture. It was the first heartbeat of community, the center around which humanity began to take shape. Alongside fire came another leap, the crafting of tools. For thousands of years, man had picked up stones to throw or wood to strike. But in the hands of the observant, these objects began to change. A sharp rock struck against another, splintered into blades. A branch, hardened by flame, became a weapon strong enough to pierce. These were not accidents of nature, but creations of intent. With each experiment, early humans learned that the world around them was not fixed. It could be reshaped. The first, stone tools were crude, but they carried profound meaning. With sharp edges, humans could cut meat from bone, scrape hides into clothing, carve wood into handles and shelters. A single stone, chipped with purpose, became an extension of the hand, harder, sharper, deadlier. These tools were not merely survival aids. They were the beginning of technology, the first signs that man's mind was more dangerous than any predator's claws. Yet the path of progress was slow, costly, and filled with failure. Stones shattered in unhelpful ways. Wood snapped under. Strain. Fires died suddenly, leaving groups stranded in the dark. Knowledge was fragile, carried only in memory, lost when the teacher fell to predators or disease. Entire generations might forget what the last had learned, forcing the cycle to begin again. Survival was not a straight path, but a struggle of trial and error, persistence against the indifference of nature. Still, progress endured. Across countless years, humans spread these discoveries from group to group, carried fire from camp to camp, passed stones shaped by hand to new generations. Little by little, what was once fragile became tradition. What was once rare became common. And with each step forward, the gap between man and beast widened. Fire and tools reshaped the balance of power. No longer did predators rule unchallenged. With torches and sharpened spears, humans began to stand their ground, to drive back threats instead of fleeing endlessly. They became hunters as well as hunted, daring to stalk the same prey that once terrified them. The meat of massive animals, once untouchable, now became food for the group. Bones were split open for marrow, skins were stretched into warmth, sinew was twisted into string. Nothing was wasted, everything was used. The discovery of fire and tools did more than change how humans lived. It changed how they thought. Each invention sparked new possibilities. Each adaptation encouraged imagination. Survival was no longer about reacting to danger. It was about preparing for it, shaping it, bending it to human will. Theirs was still a fragile existence, but it was no longer hopeless. For the first time in history, humans were not only enduring the world, they were beginning to shape it. Yet this progress carried weight. With fire came dependence. To lose flame in the wilderness was to fall back into the darkness, to invite death. With tools came danger as well, for sharper edges meant sharper wounds, and accidents could be fatal. Even advancement was a risk, and every gain was balanced by new struggles. But man pressed on, unable to turn away from the path it had begun. Sparks in the darkness had ignited more than wood. They had ignited imagination. In the glow of fire and the sharpness of stone, the first whispers of a future could be seen. A future where man would not merely survive among predators, but would rise above them. A future where thought, more than strength, would rule the earth. For now, though, fire burned low, and tools lay crude in unskilled hands. Man still lived in fear, still faced hunger, still walked beneath the shadow of predators. But the foundation was set. The story of survival had changed forever. For early man, survival was never a solitary effort. Alone, a human was frail, slower than predators, weaker than prey, stripped of fur, claws, and fangs. An isolated figure in the wilderness stood little chance against the weight of nature. But together, something remarkable happened. The weakness of the individual was transformed into the strength of the group. Unity became the greatest tool, greater even than fire or stone. In the beginning, this unity was born not of choice, but of necessity. Hunger forced men and women to move together, children bound them to one another, fear pushed them into the safety of numbers. The wilderness was vast and merciless. One pair of eyes could not see every threat. One set of hands could not provide every need. In the circle of the group, duties divided. Some gathered fruit and roots while others searched for tracks. Some watched the fire while others shaped tools. Each person carried a piece of survival, and together they built the fragile hope of endurance. Nowhere was cooperation more vital than in the hunt. Great animals roamed the plains, massive beasts with hides too thick to pierce, with tusks and horns sharp enough to kill with a single strike. For a lone man, such prey was impossible. But when the group acted as one, even the mightiest of creatures could be brought down. The earliest hunts were not battles of strength, but of patience. Men and women worked together to drive animals into traps, steering them toward cliffs or marshes where escape was impossible. Fire was used not just for cooking, but for herding. Torches waved in the night to push beasts into narrow passes. Spears were raised, not by one, but by many, striking together to overwhelm what no single arm could conquer. The rewards of these hunts were immense. A single kill could feed a group for days, its skin stretched into clothing, its bones shaped into tools, its sinews twisted into cord. But more than meat was gained in these moments. Trust was built in the chase, in the shared danger, in the knowledge that survival depended not on one, but on all. The hunt was more than sustenance. It was the forging of community. Around the fire, after the chase, the bonds deepened further. Food was shared equally, passed hand to hand, not hoarded in secret. In this sharing lay a silent understanding. Without one another, none could live. Those who gathered roots fed those who fought in the hunt. Those who watched children allowed others to roam further. Each role mattered. Each act connected to the survival of the group. It was here, in the act of sharing, that the earliest forms of culture grew. A meal was not just food. It was ritual, a moment of gathering. Here, the first sparks of language grew stronger. Gestures turned into sounds, sounds into meaning. Around the fire, men and women began to tell stories, to recall hunts, to warn of dangers, to pass knowledge from one generation to the next. What had once been instinct became memory, and memory became instruction. Cooperation also reshaped the way humans faced predators. Alone, they had fled. Together, they dared to stand. When lions prowled the edges of firelight, it was not one man who raised his torch, but many, shouting, stamping, waving the light in unison. When wolves stalked the camp, spears were lifted in a ring, ready to strike from every side. The predators of the night learned, slowly but surely, that the frail humans were no longer easy prey. They were something new, something dangerous. A group that acted as one. But unity was not without struggle. Where there is sharing, there is also conflict. In the tight circle of the group, arguments flared over food, over safety, over who led the hunt and who ate first. Anger could tear the group apart just as quickly as hunger could. Early man learned that survival was not only about fire and tools, it was about harmony, about finding balance among themselves. A group divided was as vulnerable as any lone wanderer. To hold unity together, new patterns formed. Leaders emerged, not chosen by vote or word, but by necessity. The strongest hunters, the wisest elders, the ones who remembered where water flowed or when storms came, these became the voices the group followed. Authority was not yet law, but it was the first shape of it, born from survival. And with it came the first shadows of order, of responsibility, of discipline. Over time, unity gave humans an advantage unlike any other creature. Animals moved in herds, predators hunted in packs, but man's cooperation carried thought, strategy, and memory. The group did not simply react, they planned. They marked the seasons by the stars. They remembered migration paths of animals. They built traps that spanned days of work. Theirs was not blind instinct, but shared knowledge, carried forward across generations. As groups grew, they began to meet others. Some encounters were peaceful, exchanging tools, learning new ways to spark fire, sharing stories across the glow of flames. Others were violent, for food was scarce and land could not feed all. In these clashes, cooperation turned to warfare. And once again, survival demanded unity. A single man could strike, but a group could conquer. The same cooperation that fed the tribe also defended it, binding its members ever closer. The greatest lesson of these times was simple. Survival was not the triumph of the individual, but the triumph of the many. Alone, man was prey. Together, man became predator. Together, man became more than animal. Together, man began the long climb that would one day carry him beyond fear, beyond hunger, beyond the shadows of the wilderness. Still, these were fragile beginnings. Fire could die, leaders could fall, groups could scatter. The wilderness was relentless, and nature showed no mercy. But within the circle of cooperation, within the shared flame and the shared meal, a seed had been planted. It was the seed of society, the seed of a future where man would rise not only through strength, but through unity. The story of survival was no longer about one life. It was about many lives woven together, stronger than the sum of their parts. In the echo of voices around the fire, in the footprints of the hunt, in the protection of the group, humanity had discovered its greatest weapon, the power to stand not alone, but side by side. Survival demanded more than fire, tools, or unity. It demanded movement. No land could feed a group forever. Seasons shifted, rivers dried, herds vanished, and with them, the fragile balance of survival. For early man, standing still was a death sentence. The earth itself seemed to whisper one command: move or perish. The first journeys were not planned, as grand expeditions. They began as small steps, as hungry eyes searched further than before, as weary feet wandered past familiar paths. A group followed the trails of animals, not knowing that the chase would carry them beyond every horizon they had ever known. Migration was not a choice. It was the natural rhythm of survival. The land itself was both guide and enemy. Grasslands stretched endlessly, dotted with herds that moved like rivers of flesh. Forests loomed thick with shadow, where food might be found or death might wait. Mountains rose like walls, daring man to climb or circle their edges. Rivers promised life with their water, yet blocked the way forward with their raging currents. Each step into the unknown was both opportunity and danger. Hunger was the constant driver. When roots grew scarce, when fruit trees stood bare, when prey vanished into the distance, the group gathered what little they could carry and began to walk. They carried fire as carefully as they carried children, embers wrapped in bark and ash to keep the flame alive. Without fire, the journey would end in darkness and cold. Without unity, they would scatter into nothingness. Journeys stretched into weeks, then months. Some groups moved only a short distance before settling again, but others pressed onward, driven by unseen forces, climate shifting, prey moving, storms growing. Slowly, step by step, man began to spread across the earth. Africa was the cradle, but hunger pushed humanity beyond its cradle walls. As groups moved outward, the world revealed itself in its vastness. New lands brought new challenges. In some places, cold winds tore at the skin, forcing man to wrap himself in animal hides. In others, heat blazed so fiercely that water became more precious than meat. Each new place demanded adaptation, and man answered, reshaping tools, shaping shelters, reshaping himself. The journey was not only physical, it was also mental. To migrate was to face the unknown, to trust that the land ahead would give more than the land behind. It required courage, though early man had no word for it. He had only hunger in his belly, fear in his chest, and the stubborn will to endure. With migration came new knowledge. Mountains revealed stones sharper than any before. Rivers taught the making of rafts and spears hardened by water. Cold lands taught the need for stronger shelters, the use of fire not only for warmth but for survival against ice and snow. Every mile walked was a lesson learned. Every hardship carried forward as wisdom for the future. Not every group survived. Many disappeared into the silence of the wild. Storms swallowed some. Disease claimed others. Predators feasted on the weak and the lost. Yet for every group that vanished, another pressed onward, carrying the story of humanity further. Migration was a tide. Not every wave reached the shore, but together they reshaped the world. Conflict also traveled with them. When groups met, the encounters were unpredictable. Sometimes they shared food, exchanged tools, and parted in peace. Other times, hunger sharpened into rivalry. Two groups might fight over water, over land, over a single kill. In these moments, man became predator to his own kind, proving that the greatest danger was not always lion or wolf, but other men. Yet even in conflict, humanity grew. Victory demanded strategy, demanded cooperation, demanded the use of fire and stone in new ways. Defeat taught caution, scattering survivors into new lands where they would begin again. In both peace and war, migration carved man into something more resilient, more resourceful, more enduring. As the miles stretched behind them, migration did more than spread humanity across the map. It shaped the very mind of man. The stars above became guides, patterns in the sky learned and passed down. Rivers became remembered paths, their curves and crossings etched into memory. Landmarks became symbols, rocks and trees not just seen but recognized. The world was no longer an endless mystery. It became a map carried in the mind, passed from elder to child, binding memory to survival, and with every new land, man changed himself. Bodies adapted, stronger lungs for high places, darker skin for burning suns, lighter skin for lands where warmth was scarce. What began as one became many, each group shaped by the world it walked upon. Diversity was not born of choice, but of survival, the earth itself carving humanity into countless forms. The migration never ended, not truly. It was written into the bones of mankind, an unceasing urge to move, to explore, to seek. Even when food was plentiful, even when land was kind, the horizon still called. For within humanity burned a restless fire, the same fire that kept embers alive on the journey, the same fire that lit the night against predators. It was a fire that whispered, "There is more beyond." The Great Migration was not a single event, but the heartbeat of human history. It was the rhythm of footsteps echoing through valleys, across plains, along riverbanks, and over mountains. It was the sound of children crying at night, of hunters shouting in the chase, of fires crackling in unfamiliar lands. It was the story of survival written not in words but in footprints, pressed deep into the earth and carried forward by generations. In time, these journeys would carry man across deserts and seas, into lands of ice and lands of jungle, into every corner of the world. But in these first steps, the pattern was already clear. To live was to move. To endure was to explore. And in every step into the unknown, humanity was not just surviving, it was becoming. The earth had shaped man, pressing him with hunger, driving him with fear, and scattering him across endless landscapes. But as centuries turned into millennia, something remarkable began to unfold. Humanity was no longer just reacting to the world, he was reshaping it. The age of invention had arrived, and with it, survival was no longer only a matter of teeth and claws, but of mind and imagination. It began with stone. At first, man used what the earth provided: sharp flakes from riverbeds, heavy rocks for crushing, smooth stones for grinding. But soon, instinct gave way to intention. Stones were no longer simply found. They were chosen, shaped, refined. The first tools were born not by accident, but by design. A sharp edge chipped from flint became a knife. A rounded stone tied to wood became an axe. Each invention multiplied what hands could do, turning weakness into strength. With tools, the world became different. Roots once too hard to dig could now be pulled from the ground. Skins once too thick to pierce could now be cut open. Wood too hard to break could now be shaped into spears. The boundaries of survival stretched outward, each invention carving away at the limits that once held man in place. Bone soon followed stone. From the remains of the hunt came new weapons and tools. Antlers became picks. Bones sharpened into points pierced flesh as effectively as stone. Teeth became ornaments and tools alike. Nothing was wasted. Every kill was more than food. It was material for invention, raw matter transformed into survival. Fire, too, evolved. No longer was it simply carried, a fragile ember clutched through the dark. Now it was summoned. Sparks struck from stone, friction coaxed from wood. Fire could be made when needed, where needed. This was not merely warmth or light, it was power, tamed and summoned at will. Predators that once ruled the night now lingered at the edge of firelight, no longer kings, but outcasts. Fire had shifted the balance forever, and with fire came cooking. Raw meat became roasted, safer and easier to eat. Roots that once poisoned the stomach now gave nourishment. Fire did not just protect life, it transformed it. Bodies grew stronger, energy flowed faster, and minds sharpened with each meal. Humanity's very biology began to change, molded not by nature alone, but by his own inventions. The age of invention was not only survival, it was communication. Around fires, gestures grew into shared meaning. Marks carved into wood or bone began to carry memory. Symbols passed between people. Words formed, not as we know them, but as the beginnings of language. Through invention, thoughts no longer ended with one life, they were carried, preserved, and given to the next. Shelters rose from invention as well. No longer only caves or fallen trees, but huts of wood, grass, and bone. Walls shaped by hand offered protection, warmth, and permanence. Humanity was learning to stay, to build, to create spaces of safety in a world that gave none freely. The first villages flickered into existence, small and fragile, yet seeds of the future that would follow. But invention carried a double edge. With sharper weapons came sharper conflict. Groups that once fought with stones now fought with blades. The hunt for food became a hunt for advantage. Those with the best tools controlled the best land, and with that came power. For the first time, survival was not only determined by the earth, but by the hands of other men. Still, invention pushed humanity forward. Rafts carried groups across rivers that once blocked their way. Snares and traps caught prey without the endless chase. Clothing stitched from hides carried man into colder lands. Each step of ingenuity was another wall torn down, another barrier conquered. The greatest invention, however, was not stone or bone or fire. It was the mind itself, the ability to imagine what did not yet exist. Humanity was no longer bound to the present moment. He could plan for tomorrow, dream of next season, prepare for dangers not yet seen. This was the dawn of foresight, the birth of vision. The tools he carried were not only in his hands, they were in his mind, shaping futures that had not yet arrived. In time, invention would carry humanity far beyond survival. It would build villages into cities, fires into forges, tools into machines. It would raise monuments and empires, carve art into stone, send voices across oceans, and one day, footsteps across stars. But in these first ages, invention was simple, raw and pure. It was not about wealth or glory. It was about life, about carving one more day from a world that offered only struggle. And so, humanity stood at the edge of something greater. No longer just prey, no longer just wanderers, but inventors, dreamers, shapers of destiny. The world had given its trials, and man had answered not with surrender, but with fire, with stone, with thought. The journey from fragile hunter to master of tools was the first great leap of mankind. And though countless challenges lay ahead, disease, famine, war, and change, the truth was already clear. Survival belonged not to the strongest or the fastest, but to those who could invent, adapt, and endure. Life 1,000,000 years ago was not easy. It was a relentless struggle, a story of hunger and fear, of journeys across unforgiving lands. But it was also the story of becoming. For in that struggle, humanity discovered its greatest weapon, not claw or fang, but mind. A weapon that would shape the future, rewrite the earth, and leave footprints not just in the soil, but in history itself. The age of invention was the beginning of everything. From fire to stone, from shelters to language, it was the first proof that humanity was more than just another animal. It was the dawn of a destiny that still unfolds today. And so the story closes, not with an ending, but with a beginning. The first sparks of invention, lighting the path that would carry mankind from the edge of survival to the heights of civilization.